The crack of a hand across a woman's face silenced an entire bar. Not a gasp, not a word. Just 40 people holding their breath while a man twice her size stood over her, smirking, waiting to see if she'd cry. She didn't cry. She touched the blood at the corner of her mouth with 2 fingers, looked at them, then looked at him with eyes that had already survived things he couldn't imagine in his worst nightmare. "You still have one chance," she said quietly. He laughed. He had no idea he had just made the worst decision of his military career, and she wasn't even in uniform yet. If you're new here, stay until the end, because this story goes places you won't see coming. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The drive into Coldwater Bluff took 40 minutes longer than it should have. Sleet had come down hard since Billings, coating the highway in a thin gray sheet that turned every curve into a negotiation. Nora Calloway kept both hands on the wheel and the radio off, which was unusual for her. Most drives, she needed noise, podcasts, playlists, anything to fill the space between her thoughts. Tonight she wanted silence. She'd earned it after 12 hours in the emergency department at Ridgeline Valley Medical, where she'd spent the better part of the evening keeping a 73-year-old farmer alive after a combine accident that had no business leaving survivors. He'd made it, barely. She hadn't had time to process what that meant until she was already on the highway with nowhere to be until Monday morning. Coldwater Bluff was the kind of town that barely showed up on maps. A main street, a grain elevator, a gas station that doubled as a bait shop, and somewhere among the dozen or so buildings that lined Route 9, a bar called the Ironwork that her colleague Priya had mentioned once in passing. Clean pours, no nonsense, nobody asked your business. That had sounded like exactly what Nora needed. She parked on the gravel lot beside a row of pickup trucks and killed the engine. Snow ticked against the windshield. She sat there a moment, letting the quiet settle, before she pushed the door open and walked inside. The Ironwork was smaller than she'd expected. A long room with dark wood walls, a jukebox playing something country and low, and maybe 30 people spread between the bar stools and the scattered tables. A mounted elk head watched from above the back shelf. The bartender, a stocky woman in her 50s with a silver braid and the kind of face that didn't invite small talk, glanced up when Nora came in, then went back to drying a glass. Nora found a stool at the far end of the bar, away from the louder clusters of people, and ordered water. Just water. The bartender, her name tag read Deb, set it down without comment and moved on. That was fine. That was perfect, actually. Nora wrapped her hands around the glass and let her shoulders drop for the first time in what felt like weeks. She was still sitting like that, quiet and unremarkable, when the table near the pool table got loud. There were 6 of them, men in their late 20s, early 30s, most of them broad through the chest in the way that came from institutional training rather than gym vanity. Military, she clocked immediately, or recently separated. The posture gave it away even when the clothes didn't. They were celebrating something, or trying to anyway. Shots arrived. Someone won a round of pool. The noise level climbed in stages until it filled the room and started bleeding into the edges. Nora didn't look over. She kept her eyes on her glass. One of them noticed her anyway. She heard the scrape of a bar stool before she heard the voice. A man settling in 2 seats down, uninvited, with the easy confidence of someone who'd never been told to leave a room. Rough night? She glanced over. He was younger than the others by a couple of years, with close-cropped dark hair and a jaw built for magazine covers. He had the smile of a man who thought the smile was enough. "I'm good," she said. "You don't look good. You look like somebody who needs company." "I'm good," she said again, and turned back to her water. That should have been the end of it. Most people understood "I'm good" the second time. This one leaned closer instead, resting his forearm on the bar, getting comfortable. "I'm Garrett," he said. "Garrett Hollis. You from around here?" "No." "Passing through?" "Yep." He waited, like she might keep going. She didn't. Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, not yet, just recalibration. He tried a different angle. "You a nurse or something? You've got that look?" That made her actually look at him. "What look is that?" "Like you've seen bad things and decided not to feel them." It was a sharper observation than she'd expected from him, and for a half second she almost gave him a real answer. Then she caught the grin at the edge of his mouth. the tell that he thought he'd landed something clever. And she understood. He wasn't curious about her. He was performing for his friends. "I'm not interested in company," she said evenly. His expression shifted more fully this time. The magazine cover smile tightened into something less comfortable. "That's a little cold." "That's a no." He looked at her for a long moment, that recalibrating happening behind his eyes, and she watched him make the choice. The particular choice that some men made when a door didn't open the way they expected. He flagged down Deb and ordered 2 drinks, then slid one in front of Nora. "Try that," he said. "On me." "I didn't ask for it." "I know. That's the point." Nora set her hand flat on the bar next to the glass she hadn't asked for and said, quietly, "Take it back." The two of them sat in a strange pocket of silence while the rest of the bar hummed around them. Deb had drifted to the other end. The jukebox moved into a new song. At the pool table, one of Garrett's friends looked over. A taller man, older, watching with the calibrated attention of someone cataloging a situation. Garrett didn't take the drink back. He leaned in. "You're being rude," he said, voice lower now, stripped of the performance. "I'm being friendly." "You're being persistent. There's a difference." "Friendly," he repeated, like she'd misunderstood the word. No means no the first time. She finally pushed the drink away from her side of the bar. "I'd like you to go back to your table." Something changed in his face. It was subtle. A flicker. A tightening. But she'd spent years reading people in high-stress situations, and she caught it clearly. He was embarrassed. Not because of anything she'd done, but because 2 of his friends were watching, and she'd said no loudly enough that there was no plausible deniability left. He stood from the stool. She thought he was leaving. He wasn't leaving. He said something low and ugly that she wouldn't repeat later, something about women who needed to be reminded of their place. And when she didn't flinch or look away, something inside him cracked open in the worst direction. His right hand came across in a sharp arc before either of them had moved to the next sentence. The slap landed across her cheekbone hard enough to knock her half off the stool. The bar went silent. Not movie silent, where a record scratches and everyone turns in slow motion. Just the way rooms actually go silent when something real and terrible happens in a public space. Conversations cut off mid-word. The jukebox kept playing. Nobody moved. Nora caught herself on the bar's edge. She straightened slowly, touched the corner of her mouth, felt the split there, the small, warm bloom of blood. She looked at her fingers. Then she looked at Garrett Hollis, who was standing with his chest heaving and his jaw set, waiting for whatever came next. "You still have one chance," she said. Her voice was level. It didn't shake. "Walk away." He laughed. It came out short and sharp and entirely wrong for the room. "Or what?" Behind him, the taller friend, the one who'd been watching, had gone very still. Nora was not, by any external measure, a remarkable-looking person. She was 31, medium height, with dark hair she kept pulled back in a way that was functional rather than styled. She had the kind of plain, angular face that people called handsome when they meant not soft. She'd spent 6 years working emergency medicine before Ridgeline Valley, but the 4 years before that had been something else entirely, something she didn't list on her resume the way most people would, because most people who'd done what she'd done either couldn't talk about it or chose not to. Combat medic. Attached to a special operations task force in 3 different operational theaters. Trained in trauma medicine, tactical casualty care, close quarters personal protection, and Trosarm. In her second tour, field instruction at a forward operating training site where she'd broken down rookies half again her size and rebuilt them into people who could actually function when their hands were covered in someone else's blood. She wasn't angry when Garrett's hand connected. That was the part nobody in that bar understood. She'd been in enough situations where anger was a liability that she'd developed a different response. Something quieter and more precise, like a thermostat clicking over. An automatic adjustment. Her body didn't fight the pain or the shock. It cataloged it and moved to the next calculation. The calculation now was, this man hit her in a bar full of witnesses, and he was not going to stop, and there were 6 of his friends in the room. Garrett stepped forward. "You gonna answer me, or—" She moved. What happened next took less than 4 seconds and was over before most of the room finished processing that it had started. She didn't swing. She didn't shove. She applied specific pressure to a specific place on his wrist as he reached for her again, rotating his arm in a direction it wasn't built to rotate. And Garrett Hollis went down to the floor on his knees with a sound somewhere between a grunt and a yelp. She held the position for exactly as long as it took to make clear she could hold it longer, then stepped back and let him go. He stayed on the floor, cradling his arm, staring up at her with an expression she recognized, the specific blankness of a person encountering something they had no framework for. Two of his friends came off their stools. The first one telegraphed badly, adrenaline made people sloppy, and she redirected his momentum into the bar. He hit the edge of it with his shoulder and sat down hard on the floor. The second one stopped when she turned to face him directly, something in her stillness apparently communicating what the floor already knew. She waited. He didn't move. The taller friend, the one who'd been watching from the beginning, stepped forward slowly, hands visible, no aggression in his posture. Mid-30s, steady eyes, the bearing of someone senior enough to have learned that walking into situations half-cocked was a short path to bad outcomes. "Stand down," he said, and it wasn't directed at her. She straightened her jacket. She went back to her stool. Deb was standing at the far end of the bar with her arms crossed, and an expression that suggested she'd seen most things in this room, but not quite this. Nora set 220s on the bar, enough to cover the water and whatever the disruption had cost in atmosphere, and pulled her jacket closed. She reached into the small front pocket of her coat and withdrew something small and flat, setting it on the counter near the bills. A coin, not currency, but the kind minted for a specific purpose, specific to a specific unit, with an insignia on its face that meant something to people who knew what to look for. She walked out into the sleet. His name was Staff Sergeant Devlin Marsh, and he was the reason the rest of the team had come to Coldwater Bluff to begin with. Devlin was the oldest and the most experienced of the group, which made it his unofficial and entirely unasked-for job to manage them when they were off base and in public. He'd been failing at that job tonight, he acknowledged, because he'd gotten absorbed in a phone call from his sister in Seattle and missed the moment where Garrett's friendliness had shifted into something uglier. He'd looked up when the silence hit the room. He'd seen Nora get struck. He'd moved, too slow, he knew, too slow by several critical seconds, and then he'd stopped when he saw what she did next. He stood in the middle of the ironwork and watched her walk out, and then he walked to the bar and looked at what she'd left behind. The coin was small and well-worn, the edges smooth from handling. The insignia on the face was detailed enough to be distinctive. He turned it over. He stood very still. "Garrett," he said. "What?" Garrett was on his feet now, still holding his wrist, still wearing the look of someone who'd been rearranged without their permission. "What exactly do you know about that woman?" "Nothing. She was..." "Right." Devlin closed his fingers around the coin. "That's what I thought." He pocketed it and walked to the door. Outside, the parking lot was half obscured by sleet, and the taillights of whatever she drove were already gone into the dark of Route 9. He stood in the cold for a moment, turning the coin over in his palm without looking at it. He'd seen this insignia before. Once. In a classified briefing about a joint operation task force that most of the people in his position didn't have full clearance to read about. The implications of that were enough to make the cold feel colder. The morning after, Devlin's phone rang at 6 a.m. He'd been awake for 40 minutes already, which was unusual for a Sunday. He'd barely slept. He'd spent most of the night on his phone, making calls he hadn't made in a while. Quiet, careful conversations with people who had access to personnel records, and the discretion not to ask why they were being asked. The call at 0600 was from their unit's operations coordinator, a man named Hollister, who communicated primarily through brevity and tonal flattening. "Your team," Hollister said. "All of them. Whitmore Tactical Facility. Tuesday 0800. What's the reason?" "You'll be briefed on site." The call ended. Devlin looked at his phone, then he looked at the coin on the nightstand. He'd spent enough time in this structure to know that when a full team got called in on a weekend order with a 2-day lead time and zero explanation, the reason wasn't a commendation. Whitmore Tactical Facility sat at the end of a county road outside the town of Duskfield, behind 2 checkpoints and a fence line that discouraged curiosity. It was a training installation, shamasi, functional, unremarkable. The kind of place that didn't appear in Chamber of Commerce brochures or local news. The buildings were flat and utilitarian. The grounds were designed for movement rather than comfort. Garrett and the others arrived Tuesday morning with varying degrees of dread, which they expressed primarily through silence. Nobody asked Devlin what they were walking into. He'd made clear the night before that he didn't know, which was true and also somewhat unsettling, because Devlin usually knew. The briefing room they were ushered into was standard: a long table, chairs, a screen on the far wall showing nothing yet. They sat. A corporal offered coffee, which nobody turned down. They waited 10 minutes. The door opened. Devlin recognized her immediately. She was dressed in tactical field clothing, dark green, functional, no insignia beyond rank, with her dark hair pulled back and her posture carrying the particular quality of someone who was in charge of a room without needing to announce it. The bruise along her cheekbone had developed fully overnight, a smear of purple and yellow that nobody in the room could look at without knowing exactly where it had come from. She walked to the front of the room, set a folder on the table, and looked at them. Silence. "My name is Instructor Calloway," she said. "For the next 10 days, this facility is your operational environment. That means my requirements are your requirements, and my schedule is your schedule." She paused. "Yesterday morning, 6 of you were in a bar in Coldwater Bluff. One of you struck a civilian woman across the face in public and in front of witnesses." Nobody moved. "That woman," she continued, "is me." The room made no sound at all. The HVAC system clicked somewhere in the ceiling. Garrett Hollis was sitting 3 seats from Devlin's right, and Devlin watched him go a particular shade of pale that was distinct from normal discomfort. It was the color of a man watching consequences materialize from something he'd already half convinced himself was minor. "I want to be clear about what you are here to learn," she said, and her voice didn't carry heat or performance, just the flat, controlled cadence of someone who'd given briefings in worse circumstances than this. "Yesterday, you made assumptions about what a woman alone at a bar was there for, about what she was capable of, about what the word no required of you." She looked at them steadily. "In the field, those assumptions get people killed. Sometimes your people, sometimes civilians, sometimes both." She opened the folder. "We will spend the next 10 days addressing every gap in your operational judgment that yesterday's performance revealed. You will be assessed on casualty extraction, urban environment navigation, close quarters decision-making, and medical response under stress." She looked up. "Questions?" Nobody spoke. She nodded once. "Day 1 starts in 20 minutes. Meet in the East Yard. Dismissed." They filed out. Devlin was last, moving deliberately, and when he reached the door, she said without looking up from the folder, "Sergeant." He stopped. She finally looked at him. There was nothing in her expression that indicated the previous night had any particular hold on her. "You were the one who told your team to stand down." "Yes. That's the only decision that was made correctly in that building." A beat. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. She looked back at the folder. 20 minutes. The East Yard in November was a particular kind of unpleasant. Wind off the mountains, ground frozen hard enough to jar your knees on every landing, the sky the color of old pewter. Nora stood at the center of it in a field jacket and watched 6 rangers arrange themselves into a rough line with the self-consciousness of men who weren't sure whether they were being punished or trained and suspected the answer was both. She had designed the first drill herself. "Casualty scenario," she said. "One of your team is down 200 meters northeast. You have limited visibility, unknown contacts at your perimeter. Go." They went. She watched them fail. Not catastrophically. They were rangers. They had baseline competence. But in the specific ways that told her everything about the gap between their technical training and their operational instincts. They defaulted to formation when the scenario called for improvisation. 2 of them moved to the casualty without clearing their lateral exposure first. One of them, the youngest, a specialist named Cruz, made the call to extract before confirming the site was stable, which in a live scenario would have bought a second casualty. She ran the drill again, and again. Between repetitions, she said very little, just identified the error and let them feel the weight of it. That was the pedagogy she'd developed in 3 years of field instruction. Not lecture, not explanation, just consequence. Let the gap between what they thought they were doing and what they were actually doing become visible enough to be uncomfortable. Garrett moved through the drills with the wooden precision of a man who was working very hard not to look at her directly. By the 4th repetition, Cruz was starting to adjust his sequencing. By the 6th, the formation breaks were happening faster. By the time she called them in at 1400, the cold had settled into everyone's joints, and the light was already going thin, and the team had stopped making the same mistakes they'd started with. That was something. That was the beginning of something. Nora walked back to the operations building alone, hands in her pockets, and let herself feel the ache in her cheekbone for the first time since she'd walked into that briefing room. The bruise throbbed with a dull, persistent rhythm that she could either give attention to or not. She chose not, mostly, but it was there. Inside, she sat at the desk in the small office they'd assigned her and opened the personnel files Hollister had forwarded. 6 files. Biographical summaries, service records, performance evaluations. She already knew Garrett Hollis's from her own background check before this assignment was formalized, but she read it again anyway. 28. 3 operational tours. Above average tactical scores. Below average conduct notations. 2 prior incidents of what the documentation carefully called interpersonal friction in off-duty environments. Nothing that had risen to the level of formal action. The kind of record that stayed in the gray zone, not because the behavior was ambiguous, but because the system around it had decided ambiguity was easier. She read it twice, set it aside, pulled Devlin Marsh's file. His was longer, denser, the accumulation of a man who'd been doing the work for a while and doing it mostly well. She read through the operational notes and found, near the middle, a citation from a joint exercise 4 years ago. The citation referenced an after-action report from a training evaluation, the evaluating officer's name listed at the bottom. Captain Owen Harlow. She sat with that for a moment. Then she closed the file and looked at the window, which showed nothing but darkness and the first thin scatter of sleet coming back. Owen Harlow had been dead for 2 years, and his name appearing in anything connected to this assignment, even tangentially, even in a footnote, was something she registered in the way she registered most things that required careful attention, quietly, without letting it show, and with the specific alertness of someone who had learned that the past had a way of arriving without announcement. She turned back to her desk. There was a training schedule to finish and 6 evaluations to write before 0600. She picked up the pen. Outside, the sleet came down harder, clicking against the window glass in irregular percussion, and inside the operations building, a woman who had survived worse things than a slap in a storm sat with her work and the low hum of something she didn't yet have a name for, some approaching shape just at the edge of her peripheral vision. She'd learned to watch for shapes like that. She didn't stop writing. The training schedule she'd written that night was not designed to be fair. That was intentional. Nora had spent enough time building programs for people who operated in unfair conditions that she'd stopped pretending otherwise. The drills at Whitmore were calibrated to break comfort zones, not build confidence. Confidence was cheap, and it got people hurt. What she wanted to see by the end of 10 days was how each of them responded when the structure fell apart, when the plan stopped working, when the situation demanded a different kind of thinking than the one they'd arrived with. Day 2 started before sunrise. She had them in the dark at 0445, running a search and extract scenario through the facility's decommissioned warehouse section, a maze of corridors and dead ends and rooms that smelled of rust and old machinery. No overhead lighting, restricted communication, 2 designated casualties, 4 simulated threat contacts that appeared at unpredictable intervals from behind doors and partitions. She watched from the monitoring station, where a bank of infrared cameras gave her the full picture they couldn't see. Cruz nearly walked into a threat contact in the 3rd corridor. He stopped himself at the last second, some instinct kicking in before the conscious thought, and pressed back into the wall. He held his position for 8 full seconds, which was the right call, and Nora wrote it down. Garrett moved through the same section 30 seconds later and did the opposite. He pushed through the door at pace, and the simulated threat contact tagged him from behind. In a real scenario, he was down. He kept moving anyway, which told her something about ego and something about the distinction he'd drawn between the drill and reality. She wrote that down too. By the time the scenario concluded and they assembled in the yard, the eastern sky had gone from black to a cold, reluctant gray. Nobody spoke immediately. They stood in the specific exhaustion of people who'd been working hard in the dark and weren't entirely sure how they'd performed. "Cruz," she said. He looked up. "Third corridor. You stopped." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" He hesitated. Not because he didn't know, she could tell, but because he wasn't sure if it was the right answer or just the honest one. "I heard something off, didn't know what it was, so I didn't move until I did." "That's correct." She let it sit. Then, everyone else who came through that corridor didn't stop. She looked at the group. A quarter-second decision in the wrong direction is the difference between an after-action report and a casualty report. The uncertainty wasn't a weakness. The uncertainty was the data. Nobody argued with that. Garrett stared at the middle distance with the expression of a man who was starting to hear something he didn't entirely want to. Devlin caught her eye briefly, and she looked away. By day 4, a pattern had emerged. Cruz was improving fastest, adapting his defaults in real time, which was the hardest thing to train and the most valuable thing to find. 2 others, Reyes and a quiet sergeant named Tamboli, were moving steadily in the right direction, making adjustments that stuck rather than corrections that evaporated by the next drill. Garrett was technically proficient and emotionally resistant, which was its own category of problem. He executed what she put in front of him without obviously failing, but there was a rigidity to it, a performance compliance that was just different enough from actual learning to be visible to someone who knew what to look for. He was doing the drills without letting them touch anything real. Nora had seen this before. It wasn't uncommon in people who'd been told they were good at something for long enough that being corrected had become a personal threat rather than professional information. The mechanism was self-protective and deeply counterproductive, and it rarely resolved itself without some kind of friction. On the afternoon of day 4, she gave him the friction. The drill was casualty stabilization under contact, a scenario that required simultaneous threat management and medical intervention, which was the kind of compound demand that revealed priorities in a way that clean individual drills couldn't. She put Garrett in the lead role, which meant the decisions were his. He made 2 wrong calls in the first 3 minutes. The first was understandable, a judgment call under pressure with incomplete information. The second was the same call again, despite the changed variables, which meant he wasn't processing the feedback from the first mistake. She stopped the drill. "Hollis." He straightened. His jaw was already set. "Walk me through why you made that call twice." "It was the fastest extraction route. It was the fastest extraction route the first time." "What changed between the first and second pass?" "A beat. The contact position shifted." "Right. And if the contact position shifts, what changes?" He looked at the terrain. She watched him calculate. "The route exposure." "So why did you use the same route?" The silence lasted long enough to be uncomfortable, which was where she wanted it. "I don't know," he finally said, and it came out flatly, like something he was releasing rather than admitting. It was the most honest thing she'd heard him say. "That's the right answer," she said. "Not knowing is where you start learning. Let's run it again." He ran it again. He made different mistakes, which was progress of a specific kind. The kind that looked like failure from the outside and functioned differently from the inside. After the drill wrapped and the team dispersed toward the mess hall, Devlin stayed back. He had a habit of being the last one to leave spaces, which Nora had noticed and read correctly as a senior rank instinct to monitor rather than a need for private conversation. But this time he walked toward her with the deliberate gait of someone who'd decided to say something he'd been sitting on. "He's trying," Devlin said. She didn't answer immediately. She was writing in her field notebook, the scratch of pen on paper the only sound between them. "I know," she said. "He doesn't know how to—" He stopped. Tried a different angle. He was raised in a family where showing adjustment meant showing weakness. That's not an excuse. "I didn't ask for context." "I know you didn't. I'm giving it anyway because it matters to how you read him." She stopped writing and looked at Devlin. He was steady under the look, which told her he'd earned his rank genuinely. "Why does it matter to me how I read him?" Because you're trying to build something in 10 days and you're going to get further if you know what you're actually working with. She considered that for a moment. Then she went back to the notebook. I know what I'm working with, she said. I've been watching him since day one. Devlin nodded once and left. She kept writing, but she'd heard what he said, and she filed it in the same place she filed everything that required attention without requiring immediate action. Day 6 brought rain, cold, persistent, the kind that moved sideways and found gaps in every layer of clothing. The yard turned to mud in patches. The warehouse scenarios acquired a new variable: slick surfaces, reduced grip, the sensory noise of rain on metal that made everything harder to hear. Nora ran the drills in it anyway, not to be punitive, because this was what conditions looked like, and people who'd only trained in comfort made decisions calibrated to comfort. She was in the middle of the third rotation of a communication-restricted extraction drill when her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She didn't break from the monitoring position to check it. She waited until the rotation completed, called the brief halt, and then walked to the covered overhang at the east edge of the yard and pulled the phone out. The number belonged to a woman named Sable Drummond, who worked in a legal advocacy division attached to the Department of Defense and who had been Nora's contact during the inquiry that followed Owen Harlow's death 2 years ago. Nora hadn't spoken to her in 14 months. She stood under the overhang with rain hammering the corrugated roof and called back. Sable picked up on the second ring. There's something moving, Sable said. No greeting, no preamble. She was the kind of person who operated on the assumption that if she was calling, the other party already understood the gravity. I don't have full clarity on it yet, but you need to know it's moving. The cold settled differently in Nora's chest. What kind of something? The Harlow operation. Someone is pulling records. Not internal review. This is coming from outside the chain, which means it's coordinated. The request came through a congressional liaison office, which is unusual enough that it got flagged. A flag to you? Flagged to me because I have a standing alert on that case number. I set it up after the inquiry closed. A pause. I thought we might need it someday. Nora looked at the rain coming down past the edge of the overhang. What records? The mission log, the original after-action report, and your personnel file from the period of the operation. 3 things. Specific things. Not a broad audit, a targeted pull, which meant someone already knew what they were looking for. Who filed the request? That's what I'm working on. The liaison office is routed through a committee, which gives it 4 or 5 layers of insulation. I'll know more in 48 hours, maybe 72. Sable. Yeah. How bad? The pause on the other end wasn't hesitation. Sable wasn't a hesitating kind of person. It was the particular quiet of someone finding the right way to say something accurate without softening it dishonestly. It depends on what they do with the records. If it's a legitimate review, it's uncomfortable but manageable. If it's not, she stopped. The after-action report had a gap in the timeline that was never officially resolved. You know the one. Nora knew the one. I'll be in touch, Sable said, and was gone. Nora stood under the overhang for another 30 seconds, phone in hand, watching the team move through the drill rotation in the rain. Cruz was leading this pass, and he was doing it well, reading the terrain adjustments in real time, communicating in the compressed shorthand that worked better than full sentences under stress. She put the phone back in her pocket. She walked back out into the rain. The gap in the timeline that Sable had referenced was not a gap by accident. Nora understood this clearly, had understood it since the night it was written, because she was the one who'd written the report. And the gap was there because filling it accurately would have required explaining a decision that was made in 30 seconds in a burning building with 4 civilians and 1 severely wounded officer and no good options. A decision that she had made correctly, that she would make again, and that would look to anyone reading it without the context of what the situation actually was, like something that could be framed differently. Owen Harlow had died in that building. She had gotten 4 civilians and 2 other team members out. The inquiry afterward had cleared her. Officially, completely. But cleared wasn't the same as finished, and she'd known since the day the inquiry closed that the after-action report existed in a form that was simultaneously accurate and vulnerable to bad faith interpretation. She had not until now been required to think about what that meant. The training drills continued. She didn't break cadence. Showing disruption in front of 6 people who were still assessing her was not something she was willing to do. And beyond the tactical calculation, there was something simpler. The work in front of her was real, and it required attention, and the situation with the records was 48 hours away from clarity. Burning the next 2 days in anticipatory dread was a choice she'd stopped making some years ago. She ran the evening debrief at 1800. She wrote her assessment notes. She ate in the operations building rather than the mess hall, alone, which was her default, rather than a response to the phone call. At 2100, she was still at the desk when she heard a knock at the open door. Garrett Hollis stood in the doorway. He looked like a man who talked himself into a room and was now uncertain about the decision. His hair was still damp from the rain, and he was holding a mug of coffee that seemed to be functioning primarily as something to do with his hands. "Can I—" He stopped. Started again. "I have a question." She gestured at the chair across the desk. He sat, not comfortably, and put the mug on the edge of the desk and looked at it rather than her. "The corridor drill this morning," he said, "when you asked me why I made the same call twice." "Yes." "I gave you the wrong answer." She waited. "I said I didn't know. That wasn't true." He looked up. "I knew the route was compromised. I used it anyway because changing it meant admitting I got it wrong the first time, and there were 5 people watching." The honesty of it was specific enough to be uncomfortable, the kind of admission that required something to have already broken internally before it could come out. She considered her response. "That's the right answer," she said. "It's a bad reason." "Yes, and now you know where that tendency lives in you, which means you can catch it before it happens." She picked up her pen. "That's the point." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between relief and the particular discomfort of having been seen accurately. Then he looked at the bruise on her cheekbone, which was fading now, green at the edges. "I'm not going to say anything about Saturday night," he said. I know there's nothing I can say that fixes it." "No." "Okay." He stood, picked up the mug, stopped at the door. "For what it's worth, you're the best instructor I've ever had. I'm not saying it to get something. I'm saying it because it's true and I thought you should know." She didn't look up from the desk. "Get some sleep, Hollis. Day 7 starts at 0500. He left. She sat in the quiet after he was gone and acknowledged privately that something in the room had shifted. Not repaired. She didn't deal in that kind of accounting, but different from what it had been when 6 men filed into a briefing room and went pale at the sight of her. Different was something. Day 8 was the one that broke them open, not in the dramatic cinematic way, not a breakdown, not a confrontation. More like the slow structural failure of something that had been load-bearing without anyone naming it. She ran a medical response scenario under conditions she'd calibrated specifically. 1 casualty with compound trauma, limited supplies, 2-person intervention window, time pressure, and a simulated communications failure that meant no external support was coming. The scenario was based on a real type of situation, the kind that happened in operational theaters with uncomfortable frequency, and she had designed it to be unwinnable in the traditional sense. The point was not to win it. The point was to make the best possible decisions with what was available, accept what couldn't be controlled, and keep functioning. Reyes and Tamboli ran the first attempt. They did better than expected. Reyes had a civilian medical background that showed in the quality of the triage assessment, but they hit the wall she'd built into the scenario at the 8-minute mark and couldn't get past it. And when the clock ran out, Reyes had his hands pressed to the simulated wound and was still trying to recalculate a solution that didn't exist. "Stop," she said. He looked up. He was breathing hard. "There was no path to a full save in that scenario," she told the group. "I want you to know that. The variables were stacked. The point was not to find it." She let that land. "The point was to make the best calls available, document them clearly in your mind, and maintain function. You did that. That's what you take from this." Reyes sat back. He looked like a man being let off a hook he hadn't known he was on. Then she put Devlin and Garrett in for the second attempt. Devlin was methodical and experienced. He moved through the assessment phase cleanly, identified the priority correctly, and delegated with the economy of someone who'd done this before. What he didn't account for was Garrett. Garrett, who on day one had been the rigid performing version of himself, moved through the scenario with something she hadn't seen in him until this moment, a genuine, unpolished instinct that operated below the layer of calculation. He adjusted to Devlin's read without being told to. He covered the exposure point that Devlin hadn't verbalized. When the complication appeared at the 6-minute mark, an additional simulated casualty, which she'd added to the second run, Garrett didn't freeze and didn't override. He split his attention in a way that the first 4 days of drills had suggested he wasn't capable of. She watched him and wrote nothing down. Sometimes the information was better kept without notes. The scenario ended. Devlin stood and looked at his hands. An old habit. She recognized it. The instinctive check after a medical intervention, even when nothing had actually transferred. He looked at Garrett. "Good," Devlin said simply. Garrett nodded. He didn't say anything, and the absence of a self-congratulatory comment was itself notable. She was still processing this when her phone buzzed again. She knew before she pulled it out. Sable Drummond's name on the screen. She held up a hand to the group. "Take 15. She walked to the operations building. Inside, she answered. "I have the name," Sable said. Her voice was different from 2 days ago, tighter, which for Sable was significant. The request came through a congressman's staff director. His name is Pruitt. He's on the Armed Services Subcommittee. "I don't know that name." "You wouldn't. He's not someone who operates visibly. But I pulled his committee work from the last 3 years, and he's been associated with 2 prior cases involving Special Operations After Action Review, both of which resulted in career-ending investigations for the original reporting officers." Nora was quiet. "There's a pattern," Sable said. "Nora, this isn't a review. Someone is building a case." "On what basis?" "The gap in the timeline," and a pause that carried weight. "There's a secondary complaint. I don't have the full text yet, but it's attributed to a family member of Owen Harlow." The name landed the way it always did. Not like a blow, but like a change in air pressure, something that required adjustment. "Which family member?" "His brother, a man named Dex Harlow. He filed a formal complaint with the committee 6 weeks ago claiming that the after-action report misrepresented the circumstances of Owen's death, that his brother was abandoned." The word abandoned sat in the room like a physical object. Nora stood at the window. Outside, the 6 men were in the yard, some of them sitting, Cruz doing something with a length of paracord, Devlin standing with his coffee and looking at the mountains. "When does this go formal?" she said. "There's a hearing scheduled, 32 days. 32 days. "I'll need everything you can get on the complaint," she said. "The full text, the supporting documentation, whatever Pruitt's office submitted." "I'm already pulling it, but Nora—" Sable stopped, started again. "You should think about counsel." "I'm thinking about it." "Think faster." The call ended. Nora stood at the window for a long time. Owen Harlow had been a captain and a friend and the best strategic thinker she'd ever worked alongside, and he had died on a night when the situation demanded a choice that had no good outcome. She had made the choice. She had reported it, imperfectly, in the gap Sable had named. Imperfectly, because the full accounting of that night contained details that involved classified assets and ongoing operations she'd had no authority to put in a document, even an internal one. She had made the right call. Owen's brother didn't know that, maybe couldn't know it, and someone had found him and handed him a version of the story that fit a different shape, and now 32 days stood between her and a formal hearing that had been designed, specifically and deliberately, to end what she had spent her professional life building. She turned from the window. She walked back out to the yard. "Break's over," she said. They moved. They were already moving before she finished speaking, which was a different thing from day one, and she noticed it and filed it away. The drills continued. She taught through the afternoon with the same controlled precision she'd carried since day one, adjusting scenarios, correcting errors, catching Cruz's improvement, and Tamboli's steadiness, and the particular new quality that had appeared in Garrett's movement. A loosening of the performative armor, the beginning of something more functional underneath. At 1700, she dismissed them. At 1702, Devlin was standing beside her. He hadn't heard the call. He hadn't seen her face during it, because she'd made sure of that. But he was looking at her now with the steady attention of someone whose job had always been to notice what was wrong before it became a problem. "Something happened," he said. Not a question. She considered her answer. Devlin Marsh had been the one person in that bar who'd made the right call. He'd been the one to give her information about Garrett that she'd used, whether she'd acknowledged it or not. And he was looking at her with the uncomplicated directness of someone who'd earned the question. "There may be a hearing," she said carefully, "connected to a prior operation. I'm handling it." Devlin was quiet for a moment. The mountains behind him were going dark at the tree line, the sky above them the specific shade of blue that preceded full dark in November. "If there's anything we can do," he said, "you can finish the training program." "Nora?" She looked at him. "Instructor," he corrected. She nodded once. "Finish the program. That's what helps." He went. She stood alone in the yard with the cold coming off the mountains and the last of the light going thin above the tree line. And she did something she very rarely allowed herself to do, which was to acknowledge that the situation was worse than she could manage alone, and that managing it alone was what she was going to do anyway. 32 days. She'd worked with less time and worse odds. She turned and walked back inside. And at the desk in the operations building, she opened her laptop and began composing an email to a retired military attorney named Gus Faraday, who had helped her through the first inquiry and who she'd hoped, sincerely, never to need again. She was halfway through the first paragraph when her laptop chimed with an incoming message. It wasn't from Sable. It wasn't from anyone in her contact list. The sender address was a string of random characters, the kind generated by an anonymizing service. The message contained no greeting and no signature. It contained 6 words and a file attachment. "You should have let him die." She stared at the screen for a long moment, then she opened the file. The file was a photograph, not a document, not a fabricated report or a manipulated memo. A photograph, grainy, low resolution, taken at distance with a long lens and low light. It showed a burning building and 2 figures in the foreground. One of them was moving. One of them was on the ground. She knew the building. She knew exactly where that photograph had been taken, and by whom, and under what circumstances, because she had been one of the 2 figures in it. The figure on the ground was Owen Harlow. The figure moving away from him was her. Taken at the moment she had turned from Owen, not to abandon him, but because the structural assessment she'd made in the preceding 15 seconds had told her the interior load wall was compromised, and she had 4 civilians and 2 wounded personnel still inside and approximately 90 seconds before the ceiling came down. The photograph captured the worst possible frame of the worst possible moment and made it look like something it wasn't. She closed the file. She sat very still for approximately 10 seconds. Then she forwarded the email, attachment included, to Sable Drummond with a single line. "This is what they have. Get Faraday on the phone tonight." She closed the laptop. Outside, the last light was completely gone. The yard was empty. From somewhere in the residential block, she could hear the low murmur of conversation. The team, probably, in whatever passed for unwinding after a day that had started at 04:45 in the rain. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. She let them sit in the background of what was happening in her chest, which was not panic but something adjacent to it. The specific cognitive pressure of a situation that had suddenly become both urgent and very carefully designed. Someone had that photograph. Someone had held it for 2 years, through the inquiry, through the clearance, through everything, and had chosen now to use it. The timing was deliberate. The anonymized sender was deliberate. The 6 words were deliberate. "You should have let him die." She understood the message. You moved away from him. Here is the proof. Here is what it looked like. And now imagine what it looks like to a subcommittee, to a family member who has been told a particular story, to anyone reading a gap in a timeline alongside a photograph of a woman walking away from her fallen officer. She understood it completely. She also understood that the photograph proved nothing beyond what it showed, which was a moment without its context, and that context was everything, and that the people building this case had spent 2 years figuring out how to strip that context away. She opened the laptop again and finished the email to Gus Faraday. Day 9 of the training program arrived with a clarity in the air that came from a cold front moving through overnight. The mountains were sharp against a sky that had gone genuinely blue for the first time since they'd arrived, and the ground was frozen solid, which made the morning drills cleaner in terms of surface and harder in terms of temperature. Nora ran the session. She did not tell anyone what had happened the night before. She ran the session with the same precision she'd brought to every other session, adjusting the scenarios, reading the performance, writing her assessments. The work required her full attention, and she gave it because the alternative was letting the weight of the hearing bleed into something that didn't belong to it. The team was different on day 9. That was the only word for it. Different. Not transformed, not fixed, not any of the clean resolutions that training montages and movies presented. But the 6 men moving through the final scenario sequences were not the same 6 men who'd stood in that briefing room 9 days ago with their specific varieties of shock and defensiveness and calculation. Something had been gradually, incompletely, and genuinely altered. Crews ran the final extraction drill without a single sequencing error. Reyes and Tamboli worked the casualty stabilization as a functional unit rather than 2 individuals with overlapping tasks. Even Garrett moved differently, looser, more responsive, less committed to the performance of capability, and more occupied with the actual thing. She noted all of it. She also noted that it didn't resolve anything because 10 days of training didn't undo the architecture of who a person was, it just showed them where the load-bearing walls were. What they built from that information was their own work. At 1400 on day 9, she called the final debrief. They sat in the briefing room where it had started. Same table, same chairs, same HVAC, clicking somewhere in the ceiling. Different atmosphere. She stood at the front with her assessment folder and went through each team member's performance record from day 1 to day 9, specific and unsparing. No inflation, no softening. Cruz's improvements were documented accurately. Garrett's early rigidity and subsequent adjustment were documented accurately. The errors were logged alongside the corrections. When she finished, she put the folder down. "You came here because one of you made a decision that required consequence," she said. "That consequence was this program. Some of you probably resented that. Some of you probably thought it was disproportionate." She looked at them. "I don't care about proportional. I care about functional. And by most measures, you are more functional now than you were 9 days ago." She paused. "Not finished, not fixed, more functional." Devlin, sitting at the end of the table, looked at her with an expression that contained more than she had time to read accurately. Garrett was looking at the table. She dismissed them. The call from Gus Faraday came at 18:30 that evening. He was 63 and sounded like a man who'd been woken from something, which meant Sable had reached him after hours and he'd called anyway. His voice was the particular gravel of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where bad things were being decided and had developed a specific quality of tired patience. "Walk me through the photograph," he said. No greeting. They didn't do that. She walked him through it. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd valued about working with him the first time. He asked 2 questions at the end, both precise, neither rhetorical. "The anonymized sender," he said. "You preserved the email. Full chain, forwarded to Drummond tonight. Good. And the photograph itself. Do you know who had access to that angle during the operation?" 2 possible sources. One is a surveillance asset that was operational in the area. The other is a team member who was at the perimeter. Name. She hesitated, not because she didn't know, because naming it meant making an accusation she hadn't fully formed yet. "I need to verify before I give you a name. Verify fast. The hearing timeline is working against us." He was quiet for a moment. "Nora, I want to be honest with you about where this sits. The case they're building is thin. The photograph is inflammatory but not evidentiary on its own. The gap in the timeline is a problem only if they can put a credible narrative around it. What they're trying to do is create enough smoke that the committee becomes willing to let the formal allegation stand as plausible." Another pause. "They don't need to prove you did something wrong. They need to make it unclear enough that the benefit of the doubt goes the wrong way." She knew this. She'd known it since the first call with Sable. Hearing it confirmed in Faraday's measured voice made it more concrete, which was worse in one sense and better in another. "What do I need?" she said. "Witnesses. Specifically people with direct knowledge of the conditions at the operation site on the night in question who can speak to the decision-making environment." If you can establish what the structural assessment actually showed, if someone else saw what you saw, the photograph becomes a moment without context rather than evidence of abandonment. Most of the team from that night is dispersed. 2 are still active. 1, she stopped. 1 what? 1 is someone I'd need to find. Find them, Faraday said. I'll handle the documentation side. You find the witnesses. What she hadn't told Faraday, because she was still processing the shape of it herself, was that the team member who'd been at the perimeter that night, the one who might have had access to the angle in the photograph, was a man named Stafford Briggs, who had left the service 8 months after the operation under circumstances that had been officially attributed to a medical separation. She'd never believed that. She'd had no evidence to disbelieve it, just the instinct of someone who'd known Stafford Briggs for 2 operational tours and had never once seen him sustain an injury that warranted separation. He'd been physically unremarkable, average in most metrics, exceptional in none, but stable, reliable, the kind of person who didn't generate paperwork. And then he'd generated paperwork, and she'd been in the middle of an inquiry and hadn't had the resources to pull that thread. She pulled it now. It took her until 2200 to find a current address through the network of contacts she'd maintained since separation, a careful chain of requests that didn't announce themselves as connected to each other. Stafford Briggs, according to the most recent information, was living in a mid-sized city in Idaho, employed as a logistics coordinator for a private freight company. Nothing about that was inherently suspicious. Everything about the timing of his departure from the service was. She wrote the address down. She looked at it. Then she opened her email and wrote one more message. This one to Sable, asking for Briggs's separation documentation and any financial disclosures on record. She sent it and shut the laptop. The facility was quiet around her. The mountains were dark outside the window. She sat in the particular stillness of 2200 at a military training installation, and she thought about Owen Harlow, not the photograph version, not the hearing version, but the actual person who had eaten bad MREs with her in a forward position in a country whose name she couldn't put in writing, and who had once spent 45 minutes talking her through a trauma assessment on a patient she was certain wasn't going to make it, and then turned out to be right, that the patient would, in fact, make it. Owen had been wrong about very few things. He had been wrong in the final 15 seconds of his life, about the load wall. She had been right, and she had known she was right, and she had made the call that the situation demanded, and he had died anyway. That was the truth of it. The full, ugly, non-narrative truth. No villain, no betrayal, just a burning building and incomplete information and a decision that saved 4 lives and couldn't save the 5th. She was not going to let someone rewrite that into something it wasn't. The morning of day 10, the final day, began with an equipment failure. The primary scenario space had an electrical fault that took out the lighting in the warehouse section at 0512, 13 minutes before the team was scheduled to begin the culminating exercise. The facility's maintenance contact was 20 minutes out. Nora made the call to adapt rather than delay. She restructured the final exercise on the fly, relocating it to the outdoor training corridor and adjusting the variables to account for the changed environment. It was not a smooth process. She communicated the changes to the team while they were already assembling, which meant absorbing the information mid-preparation, which was itself a test she hadn't planned but recognized as useful. They adapted. Imperfectly, with some confusion in the first 5 minutes, but they adapted. The final exercise was a full team scenario, all 6 operating as a unit, with compound objectives and a timeline that didn't allow for consensus decision-making. Nora stood at the monitoring position with her notebook and watched them move. They were 20 minutes in when her phone went off. Not a call. A text. Sable. Briggs separation docs attached. Look at the date on the financial disclosure, then call me. She pulled the attachment. The separation paperwork was standard. Medical, as she'd known, signed off by a reviewing physician and a commanding officer. She moved to the financial disclosure. The date on the first disclosure entry was 11 days after the operation that killed Owen Harlow. The amount in the disclosure was a consulting payment from a private security firm she'd never heard of. She stood very still. The payment was not large, not obviously corrupt, not the kind of number that triggered automatic scrutiny, but it was there, on the record, 11 days after a night that Stafford Briggs had spent at a perimeter position with a long lens. She called Sable. "Is the firm connected to Pruitt?" she said, without preamble. "One of the firm's registered lobbyists sat on a fundraising committee for Pruitt's first campaign," Sable said. "It's not direct, but it's there." The team was still moving through the scenario in the outdoor corridor. She could see Cruz at the far end, coordinating the extraction, Devlin running the perimeter assessment, Garrett on the casualty stabilization with the efficiency that had appeared in him on day 8. "Sable, if Briggs took the photograph and sold it, then someone has been sitting on it for 2 years and chose this moment because your assignment at Whitmore put you in a visible position again." Sable's voice was very controlled. "They waited until you were doing something public enough to make the hearing relevant." The implications landed in order, clean, and cold. The assignment at Whitmore. The training program. The thing that had started with a bar in Coldwater Bluff and a slap and a challenge coin left on a counter. All of it had created a visible footprint that someone had been watching for. A reason to make the hearing timely, to make it newsworthy, to give Pruitt's committee a hook. She had been maneuvered into a position, and the maneuvering had started before she'd driven into Coldwater Bluff. "How long have they been tracking my assignments?" she said. "I don't know yet. But Nora—" Sable stopped. "There's something else." The something else came out in the careful, measured tone of a person delivering information they've been sitting on while they verified it. "Dex Harlow," Sable said. "Owen's brother. He made the formal complaint, but the complaint language, the specific framing, the legal terminology, is not the language of a grieving family member who found a lawyer. It's drafted by someone who knows how these proceedings work. Someone who understood exactly which gap in the timeline to point at." She paused. "I don't think Dex Harlow knows what he's actually been given." Nora pressed her palm flat against the wall of the monitoring station. Dex Harlow, wherever he was, had been handed a version of the story by someone who needed a credible complainant. Someone with standing, someone with grief, someone whose name on a formal complaint carried the weight that anonymous allegations didn't. And he'd filed it because he believed it, because someone had shown him a photograph and told him what it meant. "I need to talk to him," Nora said. "That is—" Sable paused. "That is going to be very complicated." "I know. The committee will characterize it as witness intimidation." "I know." "I know, Sable. I'm not going to not do it." The final exercise was wrapping up. She could see it from the monitoring position. The team converging at the extraction point, Cruz calling the clear, Devlin running the count. Garrett was moving the simulated casualty with a steadiness that would have been unrecognizable 9 days ago. She watched them complete it. Then her laptop, open on the desk beside the monitoring equipment, chimed. She looked at the screen. It was an email from the same anonymized address as the night before. No attachment this time, just a line of text. "The hearing has been moved up. You have 18 days, and we have more than one photograph." 18 days. She read the line twice, then closed the laptop without responding, because responding to anonymous threats was something she'd learned not to do a long time ago. It gave them a data point, emotional state, reaction time, what landed and what didn't. She wasn't interested in giving them anything they didn't already have. She forwarded the email to Sable and Faraday with a 3-word note. Timeline moved up. Then she walked out to the yard where 6 men were standing in the cold aftermath of the final exercise, catching their breath, waiting for the closing assessment they knew was coming. She gave it to them. Clean, accurate, without ceremony. Cruz received the highest marks. Garrett's final performance was documented without editorializing. The program was formally concluded. She shook each of their hands. When she got to Garrett, he held the handshake a half-second longer than the others. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. Devlin was last. His grip was firm and his eyes were direct, and he said quietly, "Whatever's happening." "I meant what I said." "I know," she said. "Thank you for the program." He nodded once and let go. She watched them load into the vehicles that would take them back to their unit. She stood in the yard until the vehicles were through the gate and the sound of engines had faded into the distance between the mountains, and then she went inside and started making calls. Gus Faraday's first question, when she reached him at 0800, was practical. The witnesses from the operation. Where are we? I have 2 confirmed actives. Reyes Sandoval is stationed at Fort Carson. I've already made contact. He was at the building. He can speak to the structural conditions. She was moving through the operations building while she talked, pulling files she'd stored on the facility's secure terminal. The second is a naval intelligence officer named Wren Kastner. She was the one who called the surveillance asset that night. She has the full communications log. Does she know she's a witness? Not yet. I'm calling her after this. Okay. She could hear him writing. And Briggs. I'm going to him directly. A pause. Define directly. I'm driving to Idaho. Another pause. Longer. Nora, if Briggs is the one who sold the photograph, then I need to look at him and know for certain before I put his name in front of a committee. She pulled the last file and closed the terminal. If I'm wrong about him, I've destroyed someone's life on the basis of a payment record and a date. I'm not doing that. Faraday was quiet for a moment. Take someone with you. I'm not asking for your safety. I'm asking for a witness to the conversation. His voice carried the particular patience of a man who'd watched people make avoidable mistakes because they'd confuse self-sufficiency with good judgment. If Briggs says something useful, you need corroboration. She thought about that. He was right, which was annoying. I'll figure it out, she said. Figure it out today. You're burning time. The person she called was Devlin Marsh. She called him 40 minutes after his vehicle had left the facility gate, which meant he was still on the road, and answered on the second ring with the alert tone of someone who hadn't fully downshifted yet. I need someone with me for a conversation in Idaho, she said. It's connected to the hearing. You'd be functioning as a witness to the exchange, not a participant. It means turning around. Silence on the other end, not hesitation, processing. When do we leave? He said. I'm leaving in 2 hours. I'll be back at the gate in 40 minutes. He arrived in 38 in his personal vehicle, a gray truck that had seen enough miles to look like it meant business. He didn't ask for details on the drive. She gave them anyway, because he needed to understand what he was walking into, and because she'd decided somewhere between his phone call and his arrival that operating in isolation on this had been a form of pride she couldn't afford. She told him about the photograph, the timeline, Briggs, the payment, the connection to Prewitt. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, The team from that night, how many people knew the full picture? 6. Owen, me, Briggs at the perimeter, Kastner on comms, Reyes Sandoval at the secondary position, and a forward air controller named Dumont, who was evacuated before the building went critical. Dumont. Medical separation. Legitimate. He took shrapnel in the evacuation. He's been out 4 years. She looked at the road. He's not a factor. Okay. Devlin drummed his thumb once on the steering wheel. And if Briggs confirms he took the photograph and sold it, then we have the chain. Briggs to Prewitt's network, Prewitt to Dex Harlow, and we give that to Faraday. And if he doesn't confirm it, she didn't answer immediately. Then I'm wrong, and I need to find a different thread in the next 16 days. Devlin nodded. He didn't offer reassurance. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. Stafford Briggs lived in a townhouse development on the eastern edge of a mid-sized city called Harmon Falls, Idaho. The kind of development built in the early 2000s that had aged into a kind of beige permanence. Uniform roof lines, small squares of lawn, vehicles in the driveways that suggested people who lived within their means and didn't think too much about the view. She'd called ahead. Not to warn him, she hadn't given him her name, but because showing up unannounced at the residence of someone who might have been surveilling her felt like the kind of tactical decision that created more problems than it solved. He opened the door at her knock and recognized her in the first half-second before he managed to arrange his face into something neutral. That half-second told her most of what she needed to know. Nora, he said. Stafford. She kept her hands loose at her sides. This is Sergeant Devlin Marsh. He's here as a witness. Briggs looked at Devlin. Something moved behind his eyes that wasn't quite calculation, more like a man whose awareness of consequences had just become very sharp and very present. He stepped back from the door. Inside, the house was ordinary. A couch, a television, a kitchen visible through a doorway, a shelf of paperback thrillers, a child's drawing held to the refrigerator with a magnet. She registered all of it without commenting on it, and she sat in the chair he gestured toward without preamble. "You know why I'm here," she said. He sat across from her. He was heavier than she remembered, and tired in a way that went deeper than sleep, the accumulated tiredness of someone who'd been managing something uncomfortable for a long time. "I figured you'd come eventually," he said. "The photograph." His jaw tightened. He looked at the carpet. "It was supposed to. They told me it wasn't going to be used against you. They said it was for documentation purposes, internal review." "Who told you that?" "A man named Reeve. He came to me 8 months after the operation, said he was conducting an independent oversight review, that the after-action report had gaps that needed context." Briggs pressed his palms to his knees. "I needed the money. My daughter. She had a surgery. Significant. The insurance didn't cover it fully." Nora looked at the child's drawing on the refrigerator. "I took the photograph during the operation," he said. "They knew I had it because I'd logged the camera equipment in the perimeter report. Reeve asked if I'd preserved any personal documentation from that deployment." He exhaled. "I shouldn't have." "No," she said. "You shouldn't have. I didn't think—" He stopped. "I believed him, that it was oversight, that it wasn't going to hurt you. And when the hearing was announced," his jaw worked, "I called the number he gave me. It was disconnected." He looked up. "I've been trying to figure out I don't know what I was going to do." Devlin hadn't said a word from his position near the window. He was listening with the careful neutrality of someone who understood his role. "I need a sworn statement," Nora said. "Everything you just told me, documented, the name Reeve, the date of contact, the payment, what he told you the photograph was for." Briggs looked at her for a long moment. It's going to be uncomfortable, yes. They'll know I cooperated. They already lost control of this when they moved the hearing up." She kept her voice level. "Stafford, you were used. I'm giving you the option to correct that on your own terms rather than have it come out the other way." He looked at the refrigerator. He looked at the drawing. "Okay," he said. It came out quietly, worn at the edges. "Okay." Wow. Faraday had the draft statement framework to Briggs within the hour. Nora sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the townhouse development with Devlin across the table and a cup of something she was drinking purely for the warmth of it, and she called Sable. "Briggs is cooperating," she said. The sound on Sable's end was a very specific kind of exhale. "Sworn statement. In process. I need you to find the name Reeve, not a last name. That's all Briggs had. Working assumption, it's an alias. He approached Briggs approximately 8 months after the operation, represented himself as conducting independent oversight review. That narrows it to people who knew the operational timeline well enough to wait 8 months, someone inside or adjacent to the original inquiry. That's my read. I'll work it." A pause. "Nora, the Dex Harlow situation." She'd been waiting for this. "The contact information," Sable said. "I can get it to you, but I have to say again, I know the risk." "Huh? The committee will argue you're trying to influence the complainant. I'm trying to give a grieving man accurate information about his brother's death before a hearing turns it into a public record that says something false." She looked out the window at the street. "There's a difference." Sable sent the contact information 11 minutes later. Dex Harlow was not what she'd constructed in her mind. She'd expected anger, the burning, organized kind, the anger of someone who'd been tending a grievance long enough for it to become a framework. She'd prepared for that. She'd thought about how to meet it without either capitulating to it or fighting it, how to give him information he was owed without making him feel managed. He was 51, lived alone in a town outside Billings, and when she reached him by phone, he was quiet for a very long time after she said her name. "I wondered if you'd call," he finally said. Not what she'd expected. "Why?" she said. "Because Owen talked about you." Another pause. "Not often, but when he did, Dex Harlow's voice had the particular texture of someone managing grief that had become permanent. He respected you. He didn't say that about many people. She was standing outside the coffee shop in the cold with the phone pressed to her ear, and something in her chest moved in a way she didn't immediately have a name for. "Mr. Harlow," she said carefully, "someone gave you a version of what happened the night Owen died that is not accurate. I want to give you the accurate version. I want to do it properly, with documentation, with Faraday present as counsel, in a format that protects you as much as it protects me." She paused. "But I need you to understand that the people who approached you about filing the complaint, they used your grief. They needed someone with standing, and they found you, and they gave you a story that served their purpose." Silence. "I'm not saying you were naive," she said. "I'm saying they were deliberate." "The photograph," Dex Harlow said. "Yes. They showed me the photograph. I know. It looked—" He stopped. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, carrying something rougher underneath the words. "It looked like you were leaving him." "I know what it looked like." "Were you?" She closed her eyes for 1 second. "I had 4 civilians inside a load-compromised building with 90 seconds of structural integrity remaining. Owen's injuries were unsurvivable, not in the scenario we were in, not with what I had available. The decision I made saved 4 people." She kept her voice steady. "I did not leave your brother. I made a tactical medical assessment in 30 seconds, and I made the call the situation required. I would make the same call again." Another long silence. "Owen would have made the same call," Dex Harlow said. His voice was broken at the edges. "That's what he would have done." She didn't say anything. "He talked about you like you thought the same way," Dex said. "Like you both, like there was a way you both looked at situations, and it was the same way." He exhaled, long and unsteady. "I believed them because I needed someone to blame, because blaming a situation doesn't—" He stopped again. "It doesn't do anything with the weight." "No," she said. "It doesn't." "What do you need from me?" She told him. He agreed to speak with Faraday. He agreed to a written account of the approach made to him, who had contacted him, what they'd shown him, what they'd told him the photograph proved. He agreed to formally withdraw the complaint once Faraday had the documentation structured correctly. She ended the call and stood on the sidewalk in Harmon Falls, Idaho, in 18-degree wind, and said nothing for a while. The days that followed moved at a pace that felt simultaneously too fast and deeply, exhaustingly granular. Faraday coordinated the statements. Briggs provided his account, fully sworn, notarized, delivered to Faraday's office with the documentation of the payment and the alias Reeve. Dex Harlow provided the approach, the photograph, the framing, the specific language that Sable had already identified as legally sophisticated beyond the reach of a private citizen acting alone. Ren Kastner, the naval intelligence officer, responded to Nora's contact with 3 words. "I've been waiting." She had preserved the original communications log from the operation, encrypted, backed up, stored on a private server that she'd maintained independently because she'd had the same instinct Sable had, the instinct that said, "This isn't over," even when the official record said it was. The log showed the full timeline of that night, the structural alarm that had preceded Nora's decision by 40 seconds, the call for evacuation on the civilian channel, the sequence of extractions, the real-time assessment that Owen's injuries were critical beyond field stabilization capacity given the compound conditions. It wasn't the gap in the after-action report. It was the gap filled. The name Reeve, meanwhile, was running into walls. Sable worked every channel she had and came up against a wall of LLCs and contracted intermediaries that had been constructed with serious professional care. 3 days before the hearing, she found the edge of it. Not Reeve himself, but a consulting firm that had a registered agent who had previously worked as a staff researcher for the Armed Services Subcommittee, the same subcommittee under which Prewitt operated. It was thin, but it was a documented connection, and documented thin connections in front of a committee were different animals than allegations in the air. Faraday submitted the full evidentiary package 48 hours before the hearing. Nora read the submission the night before. Faraday had organized it precisely. Kastner's communications log, Briggs's sworn account, Dex Harlow's withdrawn complaint and accompanying statement, the financial disclosure with the payment date, the connection between the consulting firm and Prewitt's office. Each piece was footnoted and cross-referenced and presented in the specific dry, structural language that committee proceedings demanded. It was not a dramatic document. It was not designed to be. It was designed to be irrefutable. She set it down and went to sleep at 2200, which was something she forced herself to do on principle, regardless of what the following day contained. Sleep deprivation made bad decisions feel like good ones, and she'd spent too long making good decisions to compromise that now. The hearing room was smaller than she'd expected. Federal hearing rooms in films were always large, vaulted, imposing, designed to make the person at the table feel small. This one was a conference room with a long table, 10 committee members on elevated chairs behind a curved dais, a recording clerk in the corner, and the specific fluorescent hum of a government building that had never prioritized acoustics. Prewitt sat at the far end of the committee dais. She'd found his photograph in the congressional directory and recognized him immediately. Late 50s, the kind of carefully maintained appearance that telegraphed ambition rather than achievement. He looked at her when she entered, and she held his gaze for exactly as long as was necessary to communicate that she knew exactly what he'd done, then looked at the committee chair. Faraday sat beside her. He told her before they walked in, "Let me lead on the structure. You speak when I indicate. Don't volunteer. Don't elaborate beyond what's asked." Standard council instruction. She followed it. The committee chair, a woman named Adler, who had the measured patience of someone who'd been running these proceedings for a long time, opened with the standard framing, the nature of the review, the allegations as formally submitted, the scope of the inquiry. Then she said, "We've received a substantial evidentiary submission from counsel. Before we proceed to formal questioning, I'd like to acknowledge that this submission has been reviewed by the committee staff, and it raises significant questions about the nature and origin of the complaint itself." Prewitt shifted in his seat. The committee counsel, a different person, a quiet man named Abernathy who did the procedural work, stood and walked through the submission piece by piece. The communications log, the structural alarm timestamp that predated the decision by 40 seconds. Briggs's sworn account of the approach, the alias, the payment, the withdrawn complaint, and Dex Harlow's statement explaining the circumstances of the original filing. When Abernathy reached the consulting firm connection, Prewitt's hand moved to the water glass in front of him and stopped. Chair Adler looked at the end of the dais. "Congressman Prewitt, the committee staff has identified a connection between the approach made to the primary complainant and a consulting firm whose registered agent has a documented history with your office. Do you have a statement?" The room was very quiet. "I'd need to review the specific documentation," he began. "The documentation is in the submission you received 48 hours ago," Adler said. Her voice carried no heat, just precision. Prewitt said something about reviewing his records, about the complexity of the process, about the number of people who moved through his office. It came out in the specific register of a man who was still calculating whether there was a version of this that left him standing, and finding the calculation increasingly difficult. Faraday leaned to her and said quietly, "Don't react." She wasn't reacting. She was watching Prewitt's hand, which had finally closed around the water glass, and noting that it wasn't entirely steady. The formal questioning of Nora lasted 41 minutes. Adler led most of it. Specific, procedural questions about the night of the operation, the decision timeline, the conditions on the ground. Nora answered each one directly and completely, without the gap. The gap was closed now. Kastner's communications log had closed it. 2 other committee members asked follow-up questions. Both were professional. Prewitt asked nothing. She noticed that. It took the committee 3 days to issue the formal finding. She spent those 3 days at Ridgeline Valley Medical, back on the floor, because Priya had called with a staffing shortage, and because staying in motion was how Nora Calloway handled uncertainty. She ran 2 trauma cases on day 1, a rollover accident on the highway, and a farm equipment injury that required the kind of rapid sequencing she'd been teaching rangers for 10 days. She ran 3 on day 2. On the 3rd day, Faraday called at 14:32. She stepped out of a patient room into the corridor and answered. "Complete clearance," he said. "All allegations dismissed. The committee has also referred the conduct of the inquiry's origin, specifically the documented use of a consulting intermediary to approach the complainant, to an independent oversight body. She leaned against the corridor wall. Prewitt, she said, he's recused himself from the subcommittee pending the oversight review. That's voluntary, which means his counsel has already told him what the review is going to find. Faraday paused. His career on that committee is over. Whether it becomes anything beyond that depends on the review. And Owen's record. The committee chair issued a supplementary statement this afternoon. Owen Harlow's service record is being formally recognized. His decisions that night, his conduct throughout the operation. It's going in the official record. Another pause, shorter. He deserved that a long time ago. Yes, she said. He did. She stayed in the corridor for a moment after the call ended, back against the wall, looking at the fluorescent light on the ceiling. Around her the hospital moved, wheels on linoleum, the distant alarm of a monitor, two nurses passing in conversation, the ordinary noise of a place that dealt in emergencies and kept going anyway. She pushed off the wall and went back to work. The letter from Whitmore Tactical Facility arrived 6 days later. It was from the facility's training director, a colonel named Esterhagen, and it was formal in the way that official correspondence was formal. Structured language, specific references, the careful bureaucratic weight of something that had been reviewed before it was sent. It offered her a permanent instructor position, not a temporary assignment, not a consulting contract, a full appointment, curriculum development, advanced field instruction. The program she'd run for 10 days expanded into an ongoing training track for special operations medical personnel. She read it twice. Set it on the kitchen table of the apartment she'd been renting since her separation from service, which was a functional rather than comfortable space. A couch, a bed, a kitchen she occasionally used, bookshelves that were the most lived-in element of the entire place. She thought about Ridgeline Valley, about Priya, who'd called her back without hesitation, about the farmer who'd made it, and the 2 cases on day 1 of the 3-day wait, and the particular concentrated weight of emergency medicine that had been her anchor for the past 2 years. She thought about Cruz adjusting his sequencing in real time, about the specific new quality in Garrett's movement on day 8, about Devlin sitting across from her in a coffee shop in Idaho with the patient steadiness of someone who'd turned around without being given the full picture and hadn't asked for it. She thought about Owen Harlow, whose service record was now in the official document where it had always belonged. She picked up the pen. She was partway through writing her response when her phone rang. The number on the screen was one she didn't recognize. Montana area code, not a number she had stored. She answered. "Miss Calloway?" Male voice, older, careful. "My name is Aldous Prewitt." She went very still. "I'm not calling to negotiate," he said quickly. "I understand the situation. I'm calling because—" He stopped. Something in his breathing was unsteady. "My staff director, Reeve, the man who approached your colleague." "Yes." "He didn't work for me." His voice was stripped of the political register she'd seen in the hearing room. What was underneath it was harder to read. Not remorse, not quite, but something adjacent to fear. "I didn't know the photograph existed until the submission landed in my office 2 days before the hearing. I didn't commission it. I didn't—" He stopped again. "Someone used my office, the same way someone used Harlow's brother, and I need you to know that before the oversight review puts my name on something I didn't do." Nora held the phone and said nothing. "The firm," he said, "the consulting firm your attorney identified. The registered agent. He approached my office 18 months ago. I didn't know about his prior connection to the subcommittee. I ran him through standard vetting, and he came back clean." His voice dropped. Someone made him come back clean. She looked at the letter on the table, at the pen in her other hand. "If you didn't originate this," she said carefully, "then someone built the case using your office as the visible layer." "Yes." "Which means there's a layer above you." Silence. "Mr. Prewitt," she said, "who wanted Owen Harlow's operation buried badly enough to build a 2-year campaign to discredit the after-action report." He didn't answer immediately. When he did, what he said was not a name. It was a description, an operational designation, a reference to an oversight body that she had never heard of, and that shouldn't, by any structural logic she understood, have had interest in a forward operation conducted by a 6-person special task force in a building that no longer existed. She wrote it down. "I'll give you everything I have," Pruitt said. "I need it on record that I was used." "Then you need to call Faraday," she said. "Not me." She gave him the number and ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table with the pen in her hand and the letter in front of her and the name of an oversight body she'd never heard of written on the margin of a notepad, and she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who'd been in enough situations to recognize the shape of them, that the investigation she'd believed was ending had just revealed a door she hadn't known was there. She didn't sleep that night, not because she was afraid, and not because the conversation with Pruitt had broken something open in her that required immediate repair. She didn't sleep because she was working, which was different, and because the name she'd written in the margin of the notepad was pulling at a thread she needed to follow before she could put it down. The designation Pruitt had given her was OSAR 7, Operational Security and Accountability Review, Division 7. She'd been in the military for 10 years, and she'd never encountered that designation in any briefing, any documentation, any organizational chart. That absence was itself information. Bodies that existed in the open left traces, budget line items, personnel rosters, interdepartmental communications that found their way into the peripheral vision of anyone who worked adjacent to them long enough. OSAR 7 left none of that, which meant it either didn't exist or had been constructed specifically to avoid existing in any way that could be traced. She called Sable at 0200. Sable answered on the third ring with the alertness of someone who'd developed the ability to wake fully and fast. "What happened?" "New development. I need you to run a designation for me. OSAR 7, Operational Security and Accountability Review, Division 7. A pause. "Where did that come from?" "Pruitt called me." A longer pause. "Pruitt called you directly." "He claims he was used the same way Dex Harlow was used. He says the consulting firm's registered agent was placed in his office by someone, that his vetting came back clean because someone made it come back clean." She kept her voice even. "He gave me OSAR 7 as the origin, said they had interest in Owen's operation." "That doesn't make any—" Sable stopped. She was thinking, which she did audibly in the form of a particular kind of silence. A 6-person special task force in a single forward operation. What would an internal accountability body want with that? "That's the question." "I'll run it. Give me until morning." "It's already morning." "Until actual morning," Sable said, and was gone. Nora made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the notepad in front of her and the letter from Whitmore beside it, and thought about the structure of things. The structure of how a cover required scaffolding. Multiple layers, each one believable on its own, each one sacrificable if the one above it needed protecting. Briggs had been the first layer. Dex Harlow had been the face of it. Pruitt's office had been the institutional credibility. And above all of that, apparently, was something that had decided a forward operation from 3 years ago was worth this level of sustained construction. The only variable she could find that justified that level of resource was something she'd been pushing to the edge of her thinking since Pruitt said the designation. What if the operation itself had intersected with something she hadn't known about? Something that was already in motion, something that the after-action report, even with its gap, threatened to illuminate if anyone with the right access looked closely enough. Owen had been a meticulous officer. He'd kept his own notes. She hadn't thought about his notes in 2 years because the inquiry had cleared her before she'd needed them. She stood up and went to the closet where she kept 2 boxes of material from her active service years. Operational documentation she'd retained within the limits of her clearance, personal records, correspondence. She pulled the second box and opened it on the floor. Sable called back at 0647. OSAR 7 isn't in any official organizational database, she said. But I found a budget reference. It's buried in a discretionary allocation from 3 years ago, attached to a defense appropriations rider. The rider was sponsored by a congressman who retired last year under circumstances that were described publicly as health-related. What were they actually? The Ethics Committee had opened a preliminary inquiry. It was closed when he announced his retirement. Sable's voice carried the particular flatness of someone delivering information that keeps getting worse. The discretionary allocation was renewed twice, The second renewal was 6 months after Owen's operation. 6 months. Enough time to determine that the operation had produced a documentation problem they needed to manage. OSAR 7 was created to review cases where special operations intersected with, and this is the language from the appropriations rider, sensitive concurrent activities. Sable paused. That's the kind of language that means something was happening in the same operational space that nobody authorized on paper. Nora was sitting on the floor beside the open box, a bundle of documents in her hand that she'd found 17 minutes ago. Owen Harlow's handwriting was precise and small, the notes of an officer who understood that details mattered and who'd written them in the margins of standardized forms where no one would look unless they knew to look. "Sable," she said. "Owen's operational notes from that deployment. He logged a surveillance contact 3 weeks before the night of the building. A contact that wasn't in any official intelligence product he'd been given." "What kind of contact?" "He wrote it as a discrepancy. Assets in the operational area that weren't on his coordination map. He flagged it to the chain and got a response that said the discrepancy was a mapping error." She looked at his handwriting. "Not a mapping error. Deliberate omission. We'll follow up." "He didn't believe the response." "And 3 weeks later?" "3 weeks later, the building burned and he was dead, and I was writing an after-action report with a gap that I put there because filling it accurately would have referenced classified assets I had no authority to document." The line was very quiet. "The assets that weren't on the coordination map," Sable said slowly. "If OSAR 7 was running something concurrent in that operational space, then Owen's follow-up created a paper trail that connected their operation to ours. And the after-action report, even with the gap, existed as a document that someone with the right access and the right questions could eventually use to find that connection. So they needed to destroy the report's credibility before anyone asked the right questions. They needed to destroy mine," Nora said, "because I wrote it. And because I'm still here and Owen isn't." She sat on the floor with the box of documents and his careful handwriting and the particular weight of understanding something 2 years later that she'd been living inside without knowing the shape of it. "I'm sending you everything he wrote," she said, "and I need Faraday on a call within the hour." The call lasted 90 minutes. Faraday listened to all of it. The OSAR 7 designation, the budget reference Sable had found, Owen's marginal notes and their implication, and he was quiet for a long time before he spoke. "This is no longer a personal clearance matter," he said. "If what you're describing is accurate, this is an active accountability failure at the structural level, the kind of thing that has its own investigative process." "The Inspector General's office," Nora said, "specifically the DODIG. They have jurisdiction over exactly this kind of concurrent operational irregularity." A pause. "Nora, I have to be direct with you. What you're describing, if it's documentable, is large enough that it will move well beyond anything I can manage as individual counsel. You'll need to make a formal referral." "I know. And once you make it, you lose control of the timeline and the scope." "I know that too. And your name will be in the center of it, not as the cleared party, as the person who surfaced it." "Faraday," she kept her voice level, "is the documentation sufficient to make the referral?" A pause. Sable's budget reference, Prewitt's account of the consulting placement, Owen's marginal notes, and the timeline connecting the OSAR 7 renewal to the operation. "Yes, that's sufficient to initiate a formal inquiry." He paused again. "I'll draft the referral today." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. This is going to be messy and long and not entirely within your control." "I've had messier," she said. "Draft the referral." She slept for 4 hours after the call ended. She woke to 3 missed calls, one from Faraday with a question about documentation format, one from Priya at Ridgeline Valley about a scheduling matter, and one from a number she recognized as Devlin Marsh's. She called him back last, which was deliberate. "I heard the committee issued clearance," he said, 3 days ago. "Congratulations." The word came out without irony, which she appreciated. "And the rest of it? Is it done?" She looked at the notepad on the table, the designation she'd written in the margin. "There's a layer above what the committee addressed. I've made a referral to a different body." A beat. Is that going to be safe for you? The question was specific in a way that surprised her. Not is that going to be complicated, or is that going to affect the clearance? Is that going to be safe? She registered the distinction. It's the right thing to do, she said. That's not what I asked. Well, she thought about it honestly. I don't know yet. Okay. A pause. I told the team about the clearance, not the details, just that it resolved correctly. How did Garrett take it? A short silence. He didn't say much. He looked. Devlin stopped. Relieved, I think, more than I expected. She didn't have a response to that exactly, so she said, "The Whitmore letter. I'm going to accept it." "I know. How do you know?" "Because you ran that program like someone who'd been waiting to do it right." He paused. "And because you didn't drive to Idaho with a colleague just for the legal strategy. You went because you needed to look Briggs in the eye before you decided what kind of person he was." That was accurate, and she let it be accurate without commenting on it. "Take care of yourself, Marsh," she said. "You too, Calloway." The DOD Inspector General's office assigned a senior investigator named Harwick, who called her within 48 hours of the referral landing on his desk. He was direct in the way of someone who'd spent years navigating bureaucratic obstruction and had developed directness as a survival mechanism. He told her the referral was being taken seriously, that OSAR 7 was a designation they'd had flagged for unrelated reasons, and that the budget documentation Sable had provided was, he chose the word carefully, significant. He also told her that the investigation would be independent of her, that her role was referent rather than participant, and that the process would take time, months, possibly more. She told him she understood. What she understood specifically was that the people who had built the 2-year campaign against her had done so because a dead man's careful notes threatened to expose something they'd decided was worth protecting. Owen Harlow, who had written not a mapping error, deliberate omission in the margin of a standard form because he was constitutionally incapable of letting a discrepancy go unexamined, had been the actual threat. She'd been the mechanism for containing it, discredit the report, discredit the reporter, bury the document in the noise of a professional destruction. They'd underestimated how difficult that was to complete when the person they were trying to bury had survived things considerably harder than a congressional subcommittee. She thought about Owen and the way he'd looked at problems, with the same relentless refusal to accept a bad answer just because the answer was convenient. And she thought that the most complete thing she could do for him was exactly what she'd done: refuse to let the record be wrong. The IG investigation proceeded without her involvement. She followed it from the periphery through Sable, who had sources in the oversight structure and the particular professional habit of sending updates without being asked. What those updates told her over the following weeks was a story that assembled itself piece by piece the way investigations did, not dramatically, not in a single revelation, but through the accumulation of documented facts that eventually became too specific to deny. OSAR 7 had been running a concurrent intelligence gathering operation in the same regional space as Owen's task force. The operation was not authorized through standard channels. It had been established through the discretionary appropriations mechanism as a way of bypassing the oversight requirements that applied to formally designated programs. The assets Owen had flagged as a discrepancy on his coordination map were OSAR 7 assets, operating without the knowledge of the Joint Command structure. When the building burned and Owen died and Nora wrote an after-action report with a gap that referenced, even in its absence, the existence of assets she hadn't been told about, OSAR 7 had recognized that the documentation created a vulnerability. Not immediately. It had taken them 8 months to determine that the gap was exploitable and another year to build the scaffolding of Briggs, Pruitt, Dex Harlow, the photograph. The senior official responsible for OSAR 7's establishment and ongoing authorization was a deputy director whose name Nora had never encountered. He'd operated several layers above any interaction she'd ever had with the institutional structure. He resigned his position 6 weeks into the IG investigation. The resignation was covered in the defense press as a retirement announcement. The subtext, for anyone who knew how to read it, was considerably less voluntary. Sable sent her the announcement with a single line, "That's him." Nora read it, set her phone down, went back to the curriculum she was drafting for the Whitmore program. She started at Whitmore on the first Monday of December. The drive from Ridgeline Valley took 3.5 hours. She'd cleared her apartment the week before, putting what was worth keeping into the back of her truck and leaving what wasn't for whoever came next. It wasn't much. The bookshelves had been the most substantial part of it, and she'd been selective about which books made the trip. The functional apartment had been exactly what she'd needed for 2 years, and was nothing she was going to miss. The facility in winter was a different place than she'd seen it in November. The mountains beyond the fence line were heavily snow-covered now, and the morning light hit them at an angle that turned everything briefly silver before the day settled into its working colors. She pulled into the staff lot and sat for a moment looking at the main building. Then she got out and went to work. Colonel Esterhagen was a compact man in his late 50s who communicated primarily in specifics and seemed to treat efficiency as a moral position. He walked her through the permanent instructor setup in 20 minutes. Office space, curriculum parameters, the existing training track she'd be augmenting, the evaluation framework, the personnel she'd be working with on the administrative side. The program you ran in November, he said as they walked the East Corridor, generated the strongest cohort assessment scores we've seen in 3 cycles. The cohort generated them, she said. I built the conditions. He looked at her sideways. That's the right answer. I know. He almost smiled. You'll have full curriculum authority on the advanced medical track. I'll want a quarterly review, but the design is yours. He stopped at a door and opened it. This is your office. It was small and had a window that faced the mountains. A desk, a chair, 2 filing cabinets, a whiteboard that someone had erased recently and not entirely successfully. The ghost of a previous instructor's diagram was still visible in the upper right corner. She put her bag down. One thing, Esterhagen said from the doorway. She looked at him. The IG matter. The referral you made. He held her gaze. That was the right call. Yes, she said. It was. He nodded once and left. She stood in the small office with the mountain view and the ghost of someone else's diagram and the particular silence of a new space that hadn't been shaped by her yet. And she thought that this was what most people didn't understand about starting over. It wasn't relief. It wasn't the clean slate feeling that movies sold. It was more complicated than that, more shot through with the weight of what it had cost to get here, and the knowledge that some of that weight didn't leave, you just learned to carry it differently. Owen wasn't here. He wasn't going to be here. That was a fact that didn't resolve into something more comfortable with time. It just became more familiar. She'd made the right call and he'd died anyway, and those two things coexisted in the same truth without canceling each other out. She put her coat on the hook beside the door and opened the curriculum files on the desk and started reading. 3 weeks into the position, she got a visitor she hadn't expected. Garrett Hollis appeared at the facility's main entrance on a Tuesday afternoon in civilian clothes, without his unit and without advance notice. The gate personnel called her to confirm he was expected, and she paused for 2 seconds before telling them to let him through. He found her in the East Yard, where she was running an assessment exercise with a new group, 8 medics from a rotational assignment, none of them rangers, all of them with the particular attentiveness of people who knew they were being evaluated and hadn't yet figured out how to relax into that. She called a water break and walked to where he was standing at the edge of the yard. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him. Not physically. Same build, same face, same jaw built for photographs. But the particular performance layer she'd spent 10 days watching him shed was gone, and what was underneath it was a person who looked like he was getting used to his own weight. I didn't call ahead, he said. I noticed. I didn't know if you'd say yes. I might not have. She kept her tone neutral, not cold. What do you need, Hollis? He looked at the group across the yard, who were pretending not to look back. I put in for a transfer to a unit with a more advanced medical integration track. He looked back at her. The evaluation you submitted. The language you used about my day? 8 assessment. It made the difference in the transfer board's decision. She waited. I wanted to say thank you in person. He paused. And I wanted to tell you that the conduct review, the formal documentation from the bar, I'm not appealing it. I know, she said, Your JAG officer submitted the non-appeal notice last week. He looked slightly surprised that she knew. I'm the complaining party, she said. I receive updates. Right. He shifted his weight. I'm not saying it to get credit. I'm saying it because I wanted you to know I understand it's correct. What I did was, it was wrong. Specifically and fully wrong. And the documentation existing is the appropriate consequence. She studied him for a moment. The thing about people who were actually changing was that it looked nothing like the movies, Mike. No singular transformative moment, no clean before and after. It looked like this: uncomfortable, imperfect, a person trying to find language for something they were still in the middle of. The transfer board made the right call, she said. You're better in that environment than you were in the one that let the November version of you exist as long as it did. He absorbed that. Is that a compliment? It's an assessment. The edge of something, not quite a smile, too weighted for that, crossed his face. Fair enough. He looked at the group across the yard. They're watching you instead of taking their break. They do that. She turned back toward the yard. Get off my facility, Hollis. You're a distraction. Yes, instructor. He left. She didn't watch him go. She walked back to the group and called the end of the water break and went back to work. And if she carried the conversation with her for the rest of the afternoon, it was because it had confirmed something she'd started to suspect during those 10 days. That people were more malleable than the worst version of them suggested, and more capable of accountability than the systems around them usually required, and that the gap between who someone was and who they could be was often just the distance between comfortable and uncomfortable. She'd been making people uncomfortable professionally for years. That, she thought, was probably not an accident. The official recognition came in January. Not a ceremony, which she'd made clear to Faraday she didn't want, and which he'd made clear to the relevant parties in terms direct enough to be unambiguous. What arrived instead was a formal document, a letter from the committee chair copied to the appropriate command level, stating unambiguously that the allegations brought before the subcommittee had been dismissed in full, that the investigation had revealed the allegations to be the product of a coordinated effort to manipulate the review process, and that the committee was formally entering into the record its recognition of Nora Calloway's service and the integrity of her decision-making during the operation in question. And separately, a second document, the formal restoration and recognition of Owen Harlow's service record, signed by the relevant authority, placing into the official archive an accurate account of his conduct and his death. She read both documents at her desk in the small office with the mountain view. She read Owen's twice. There was something she hadn't expected in the reading of it. Not relief exactly, because she'd already carried the clearance for weeks and the emotional weight of it had settled into something more sustainable than acute. It was more specific than relief. It was the particular feeling of something being in the right place after being in the wrong one long enough that you'd started to forget what right looked like. Owen's record said what it should have said 3 years ago. His name was attached to an accurate account of who he'd been and what he'd done and how he'd died. Nobody could go into that archive now and find a gap that implied something false. The gap was closed, and the truth was in its place, and nobody had done that for him except the woman who'd been in the building when it burned. She set the documents down. Outside the window, the mountains were very clear. The kind of clear that only happened in January in Montana, when the air was cold enough to strip everything back to its essential lines. She looked at them for a while. Then she opened her email and wrote a short message to Dex Harlow. She'd been in irregular contact with him since the hearing. Not frequent, not intimate, but occasional. He'd needed, she thought, to have access to someone who could answer questions without an agenda, and she'd been able to do that from a sufficient distance that it didn't compromise either of them. The message was brief. She told him the recognition document had been issued. She told him Owen's record was formally complete. She told him that his brother had been, in every respect that the official record could capture, exactly who he'd always believed him to be. Dex replied 20 minutes later. Thank you for fighting for him when I couldn't. She read it, looked at the mountains, typed back. He made it easy. He was right. What nobody tells you about vindication, the real kind, the documented and officially recognized kind, is that it doesn't fill the space left by what it cost. Nora understood this practically. She'd always been better with practical understanding than with the version of things that required feelings to be organized into something presentable. The cost of the past 3 years had been specific and varied. The hours, the uncertainty, the particular grinding weight of being accused of something she hadn't done, while also knowing that the truth was complicated enough that she couldn't explain it simply. The cost of the operation itself was older and heavier, and not something a committee recognition resolved, because Owen's death was not something that lived in the official record. It lived in the way she sometimes caught herself reaching for a thought pattern she'd developed with him. A specific analytical frame that had been built by two people working alongside each other long enough to develop shared instincts, and finding it there, but finding it incomplete. Half a thing. You didn't get that back. You learned to work with what remained. She learned to work with what remained. The Whitmore program grew in ways she hadn't fully anticipated when she accepted the position. The first cohort under the permanent track ran in February. 12 medics, mixed unit composition, a more complex and extended curriculum than the 10-day emergency version she'd run with the Rangers. She built it the way she built everything, from the conditions outward, from what the actual situations demanded, rather than from what the theoretical standards specified. Cruz came through on a different rotational assignment in March. He wasn't in her program, wrong unit, wrong timeline, but she ran into him on the East Corridor and he stopped and looked at her and said, "Instructor Calloway." "Specialist Cruz." He grinned, which was the expression of someone who'd grown 2 sizes in a short time and was still adjusting to the fit. "I made a recommendation," he said, "to my unit's medical integration officer about the sequencing protocol you used in the casualty extraction scenarios. And they're piloting it next rotation." She nodded. "Let me know how it runs." "Yes, ma'am." He went. She continued down the corridor and thought about the specific multiplication of careful work, how the thing you did correctly in front of one person became the thing they did correctly in front of 12, and those 12 did it in front of others, and eventually the decision made in a frozen yard at 04:45 in November became a sequencing protocol piloted in a unit she'd never directly touched. That was the math of instruction. It was the reason it mattered more than most things she'd tried. Sable Drummond came to Whitmore in April. She drove out from Billings on a Saturday, which was unusual because Sable treated weekends as professional days with a slightly different dress code. She arrived at the facility gate with coffee and the expression of someone who'd decided to deliver something in person. They sat in Nora's office, Sable in the visitor chair, Nora behind the desk, the mountains doing what they always did out the window. "The IG has finalized the initial findings," Sable said. OSAR-7 is being formally dissolved. The authorization mechanism, the appropriations rider, has been flagged for legislative review, which means the next defense appropriation cycle will include oversight provisions that close the gap. What about the deputy director? His resignation triggered an automatic conduct review. The IG findings will be referred for potential prosecution on 2 specific counts. Sable paused. "I can't tell you the outcome of that because I don't know it, but the referral is real. And the people below him, the ones who built the campaign. Reeve, actual name Theodore Vassell, former OSAR-7 staff contractor, has been named in the referral. He's cooperating in exchange for reduced exposure, which means the IG now has his full account of the operational sequence." Sable looked at her steadily. "You surfaced most of this, Nora. The referral wouldn't have had the specific documentation it needed without the chain you assembled." "Owen surfaced it," Nora said, "in the margins of a form no one was supposed to look at." Sable was quiet for a moment. "Yes, he did. Then the acknowledgement belongs there." They sat with that for a while, both of them looking at the mountains, the silence between them, the comfortable kind that came from having been through something together and not needing to narrate it. "The Whitmore position," Sable said eventually. "Is it what you wanted?" Nora thought about the question honestly, which was the only way she answered questions. "I don't know if I had something specific I wanted. I had what the work required." She looked at the desk, the curriculum she was mid-draft on, the assessment notes from last week's cohort, the whiteboard with the ghost diagram in the corner that she'd decided to leave rather than erase, as a reminder of whoever had been here before her and the work they'd done. It's the right place. That's not the same thing. No, she said, but it's enough. Sable drove back to Billings in the afternoon. Nora walked the facility perimeter after she left. Not a patrol, not a security measure, just the particular need to move that she'd always had when something in her was processing rather than working. The mountains were at their best in April. Snow still on the upper faces, but the lower slopes going green in irregular patches that said winter was negotiating its exit rather than holding firm. She walked, and she thought about what the last 5 months had been, and what they'd cost and what they'd built. And she came to the thought that she'd been coming towards since the night she'd walked out of the ironwork bar in Coldwater Bluff with split blood on her lip and a coin on the counter. The thing about being underestimated was that it revealed something true about the person doing the estimating. It showed you the size of their imagination, the specific smallness of the box they'd decided you fit inside. The slap in the bar had been an act of contempt, and contempt required the person doing it to have already decided what you were and chosen to be incurious about whether they were right. She'd spent her whole professional life being the version of a person that other people's incuriosity couldn't fully see. It had been, at various points, lonely and useful and occasionally dangerous, and she'd never wasted time being angry about it because anger at other people's limited vision was its own kind of trap. It made their limitation into your problem. What she'd learned, or maybe more accurately what she'd always known and had confirmed in this particular sequence of events, was that the answer to contempt wasn't rage, and it wasn't performance, and it wasn't the need for the person who underestimated you to eventually understand what they'd gotten wrong. The answer was the work. The work done correctly, over time, in the conditions that actually existed rather than the conditions you wished you were operating in. You did the work. You made the calls the situation demanded. You wrote the report as accurately as you could within the constraints you had. You drove into a storm on a Friday night looking for quiet, and when the quiet was disrupted, you handled it. And when the handling of it set off a chain of consequences, you hadn't predicted you followed that chain to its end. Not because it was clean, not because it was fair, because it was in front of you, and because the alternative was letting something false stand where something true should be. And sometimes, not always, not as reliably as movies promised, the record corrected itself. Sometimes the gap in the story got filled. Sometimes the man who hit you in a bar became the person who stood in a yard in the rain and started learning something real. Sometimes the documents that said what happened actually said what happened. It wasn't justice in the clean, symmetrical sense. Nothing was, really. It was closer to gravity, not moral or immoral, just a pull toward what was accurate. Things that were wrong tended toward correction over time if enough people kept pulling in the right direction. Not inevitably, not without cost, but often enough to keep pulling. She stopped at the east corner of the perimeter, where the fence met the tree line and the mountains were closest. The late afternoon light was doing something complicated with the snow on the upper faces, a warm color against the cold white that had no business looking as good as it did. She stood there for a while. She thought about Owen, who had noticed a discrepancy and written it in a margin because that was simply how he was built, the kind of person who couldn't let a wrong thing go unexamined even when the wrong thing was small and the noting of it was inconvenient. She thought about how that quality had gotten him killed, indirectly, in the specific way that careful people sometimes became threats to careless systems simply by being what they were. She thought that the best thing she could do with the time she had, which was what everyone was always ultimately working with, time and attention, and the particular irreplaceable fact of being present and capable in the world, was to be exactly that kind of person, the kind who noticed, the kind who wrote it down, the kind who didn't accept mapping error as an explanation when the evidence said otherwise, the kind who, when hit in a bar by someone who thought silence meant absence, said quietly, "You still have one chance," and meant it. Not as a threat, as information. This was who she was. Not perfect, not uncomplicated, not untouched by what it had cost to get here, but clear on what she stood for, on what the work demanded, on what the truth required. She turned from the mountains and walked back toward the facility. There was a cohort assessment to prepare and a curriculum section to finish, and a whiteboard in a small office with a mountain view where someone had left the ghost of their work in the upper right corner And she was going to add her own marks to that board tomorrow morning and the morning after that. And the work would carry on through whoever came next, imperfect and essential and worth doing correctly. She went inside. The door closed behind her. The mountains held their light a little longer, the way they did in April, before the dark came in from the east and the facility settled into its nighttime quiet. And somewhere in the building, a woman sat at a desk and opened the next page of the thing she was building and kept going.